I somehow thought we would have 10 or 11 people today joining us for a nice, quiet talk about academics and their relevance and whatnot in Washington. For those of you whom I've not met, I'm Steve Clemens. I run the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation, and I'm really thrilled that there's so much interest, particularly on such short notice, in the subject of how academic expertise and expertise in general fits into the big policy challenges facing the country on a lot of different fronts. I'm very pleased to recognize our co-sponsors today of today's program, the Social Science Research Council and the American Academic Research Institute in Iraq. In particular, I want to thank Tom Asher of the Social Science Research Council, who's responsible for really pulling all of this together, along with Samir Lawani and, of my staff, and Stephanie Platz of the American Academic Research Institute in Iraq. I want to thank everyone. We just had a very interesting meeting down in my office, sort of talking about this, and I've been an occasional. I've flirted with academia now and then. Of course, everyone knows the Social Science Research Council and the critical and important role that it has played in high-quality intellectual work in the United States. And I was fascinated when the SSRC came to us and said, let's do a program together, because with all due respect to my friends at the SSRC, I always thought it was so serious that it kind of bordered on bland, and we try very much not to. And so just spent some great time with them, and they basically are very interested in the kind of politics of expertise, which is a really fundamental question for anyone that's been looking at this, and it's not a new question. For those of us who've been looking at questions of occupation or warfare or framing military issues, this has been a subject that's been around for a long time. But I have to say that I think it's the first time I've seen the SSRC bring this kind of this sort of inquiry into a policy setting. And I'm absolutely thrilled and honored that we could work together to do that. And to help launch a process that we hope to make an ongoing set of discussions, almost a set of case studies, looking at these challenges. And frankly, I think in the future we'll have both oral histories and case studies, as I think we'll hear from today, but I also think that we'll have some folks that may see the process working better than you may suspect, and have some debate and discourse in different parts of this discussion of those people who see expertise being well used, because I do think that there are probably narratives out there that would be useful to bring to this, to look at some of the positive oral histories of that and what templates have worked and not. And as someone whose significant other is in academia, I also think there's some fair critiques on the academic side of this that the policy community should not bear the burden for, as I look at young academics trying to become tenured, where they are given a negative incentive for playing a role in the policy realm, writing op-eds. In fact, it can harm them among their so-called peers who have to rate them and think about them as being substantial intellectuals. So let me tell you just a little bit about two people who really ought not to need anything told about them. McGuire Gibson, just to my right, is one of the world's leading authorities on ancient Mesopotamia. He's really cool. I recommend that people Google him. He's the kind of guy that movies are made about. He is a professor of Mesopotamian archaeology at the University of Chicago. He's conducted fieldwork in Iraq, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. Served as an advisor to UNESCO and other cultural and scholarly organizations working to preserve the archaeological heritage of Iraq. Has been in and out of Iraq just dozens and dozens of times. My home base sort of is Japan, where I've been in and out of the country something like 75 times. Sure, this is the kind of expertise we have with us today from Iraq. McGuire Gibson is also president of the American Academic Research Institute in Iraq and our co-sponsor today. Then my buddy, and I call him my buddy because I'm very, very proud to have developed a close friendship and working friendship with Juan Cole, who's a chronicler of so much of the America's engagement in the Middle East, particularly in the post-9/11 environment. And we just wouldn't know as much as we do today if Juan didn't sit there translating front-page articles, headline articles that are running in the Arabic press and bringing them to us, a role that used to be standard in other countries like Japan. There used to be somebody who did this. Juan does this on his own time, and perhaps even to his own detriment in his University of Michigan role. He writes one of the best blogs in the business. I'm a big blog supporter, a blogger myself, and He writes informed comment at www.juancole.com. I recommend those watching on video to go check Juan Cole's daily and important commentary out there. He's the Richard Mitchell Distinguished University Professor of History at the University of Michigan. He's president of the Global Americana Institute. We were recently very privileged to have Juan here talking about his most recent book, Napoleon's Egypt, Invading the Middle East, and the parallels that he was looking at in Napoleon's time and North Africa and the Egyptian world at that time have, I think, very important complementarities with where we're at today. So I'm pleased that Juan Cole is here, and writer for Salon.com, and he, again, it's a real pleasure to have him. Why don't we start with McGuire Gibson, who's going to share with us for about 10, 12 minutes his view. Then we'll have Juan Cole, and then I will begin to open a conversation. And I want to have a conversation rather than just Q&A on these subjects, because I know there's some people in this room who could just as equally be up here in front sharing their own expertise. So with that, McGuire Gibson. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, he's telling me I've got 10 minutes, and no academic can talk for 10 minutes, but we'll see what I can do. My involvement with trying to influence the government at all begins sort of publicly back in the year 1990, 1991 with the Iran-Iraq War. What was very interesting about that war was that when you put together a panel on Iraq in an academic setting or any other kind of setting, you could have 4 or 5 panelists up on the stage, and I would be the only person on that panel who had ever been inside the country. And there were 2 or 3 older academics who had done their field work or done their academic research work in Iraq in the 50s before the Iraq Revolution, but they hadn't been able to go back to do active field work, active research in social sciences in Iraq since the revolution, with some exceptions. There were, as I say, there were almost no people who really had been inside the country and therefore knew the country as an entity they were quite familiar with. I've been going to Iraq since 1964, and I've been there just about every year since then, except for the last 4 or 5 years. My last time was in 2003, just after the end of the war. I was there in May for about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and have not been back since. With this war, the 2003 war, what's quite interesting is although the media only really draw upon certain people, and usually you see Fuad Ajami or a few other people like that, who also, most of them had not at that point been inside Iraq. We have a few people like Juan Cole who would be called on, who had been inside. There is now existing a whole group of younger scholars who are really experts on Iraq's history and its politics leading up to today. And these people have been developed over the last 10 years, 10 to 15 years. So you can now put together a panel with people, with some older academics and younger academics who know the country intimately, who know the history intimately, and so the situation has changed quite a bit. Now, when I began to go and to talk to the Pentagon and the State Department in 2003, my initial contact had been in letters that I had written. I just looked through files yesterday and was surprised to find a very, very long letter that I had written to Ambassador Crocker, who at that point was an undersecretary at State. But I had known Crocker since 1978 in Baghdad when he was a junior officer, before he became ambassador in Kuwait and Syria and various places. And I wrote a long letter in which I said that obviously war is coming in Iraq. I wrote this in the fall of 2002. I said war is coming in Iraq, and when this happens, these following things are going to happen. And I said, I head up this organization called the American Academic Research Institute in Iraq, and we are, we will be ready to help in any way we can, but, that people should know that there's going to be a problem here. And I pointed out that there was going to be massive looting, not just of archaeological sites and museums, there would be looting in general. And anyway, that was where that stood. In January of 2003, I was with a group of people who went into the Pentagon to speak to a group of people there. We never got beyond we were about the 3rd level down. And in that meeting, I talked about Chicago, the cultural heritage of Iraq. I talked about the importance of Iraq as the world's earliest civilization, that we were walking into a place that had 5,000 years of civilization, and that there were thousands of archaeological sites and they would be damaged, and there were standing monuments that would be damaged. But I also talked about what would happen with an invasion. I talked about the looting, and I also said things like there will be massive looting inside Baghdad. I did this both at the State Department and Defense. And in the State Department, it was a much more, there were different sorts of interests in what we had to say. As a result of that meeting, I was put in contact with a group of mappers, and I gave them the locations of over 5,000 archaeological sites. And they put them on the no-target list. I also gave them lists of over 100 standing monuments in cities and elsewhere, which were also put on the no-target list. I pointed out every place that we went that the most important archaeological site in the country was the Iraq National Museum, and they said we know about it, and it was on a no-target list. But I also pointed out that if chaos did ensue, that it would be looted along with every other museum, which in fact did happen. After talking to the State Department, I then got involved, at least in a peripheral way, with trying to find Iraqi archaeologists and heritage people. That means people who deal in things which are less than 200 years old, but are still part of the heritage of the country, to go to take part in the Future of Iraq project. And they had two small meetings. I attended the first one because the Iraqis were not comfortable if I weren't there. So I attended the first one. I didn't attend the second one. They didn't have enough time. This was already too late. They didn't end up doing a report or anything else. But they did have some preparation for what was going to go on. Now, when I was doing this, what was very interesting, the reaction from my academic colleagues was one of, oh, you're taking a very dangerous position to be helping to do this, to advise the government at all, to try to influence policy. This is a very, very dangerous thing. And that comes out of a history of academics dealing in the real world. It goes back to the Vietnam War, in which several academics were very, very badly burned, getting involved, especially people like anthropologists and sociologists, getting very badly burned in terms of their careers for dealing with things which ended up being incorporated into things like the Operation Phoenix program, and they lost their academic careers. And it goes back even earlier than that. And although in the World War II, academics had very, very much a part of the war, and they served in all sorts of functions, including the OSS. In the 50s, the CIA used academics, especially from the University of Michigan, as a cover for activities in Syria, which resulted in the coup that brought about the first of the coups, which then went on for another 4 or 5 years until the Ba'ath took control. And the people who were involved in this also were very, very damaged in their careers. One of the women I knew very well was unable to get a job in the United States at all, ended up teaching at the University of Kuwait for the rest of her career. So there is always this problem of what you do academically bringing about an effect which you think of as being unethical or as being against your own interests or your own view of what's going on in the country. So there's that sort of a dynamic. So what I was doing was looked upon as something very questionable when I was doing it. And especially once the war came and the looting started and the looting in the museum started, and I became a very public figure at that point, people were thinking, well, this is, see, this has done no good. What you've done has done no good. You warned, and it still happened. So that's there is this tension that exists on the part of the academics, but there is also a certain amount of suspicion by government figures and Pentagon figures of the academics involved. Once I began to point out that the museum had been looted and that there had been a warning about it, I think I was put on a list, and my access was stopped. I occasionally still get a letter, or I get an email occasionally from someone in the military who's saying, I am at such and such a place, there's this site here, we want to do something about it, what can you tell us about it? They've seen me, they've pulled down a website, something on a website. And so I send them a thing saying, yes, I'll be glad to help you in any way. I'll give you any information you can on that. And I always tell them that they should be bringing in the antiquities people in Baghdad, because that's a central thing, and everything should be coordinated through them. And then I never hear anything else from them. And either because they've been told that not to deal with me, or they go off on another angle. They don't want to deal with the people in Baghdad. So anyway, there's a certain amount of, again, tension. And how that can be resolved, and how academics relate to policy, how academics relate to government in general, is what this is about. So I'll stop there. Is that 10 minutes?
Thank you. Perfect. McGuire, thank you. Juan Cole.
Well, thank you very much to our hosts, the New America Foundation and the Social Science Research Council and TARI, for having this event. I mean, I think obviously the Iraq War in particular has pitched the issue of expertise and the relationship of academics to the government in a very special sort of way. And one of the things that's pretty obvious is that the people who were decision makers about invading Iraq in 2003 were largely ignorant of the country as it really existed. And I would say the one exception to this statement would be with regard to Dick Cheney, the vice president, who was very important in pushing for the war and its aftermath, who had been Secretary of Defense during the Gulf War and who knew all about the region, and who had spoken earlier on. And we have the YouTube video of him in 1994 warning about all the horrible things that would happen if you tried to do regime change in Baghdad. But he appears to, despite knowing these things, have decided that for some reason the risk had become worthwhile in the meantime. But other personnel displayed enormous ignorance of the place. And it wasn't that we didn't have people in government who knew something serious about Iraq. We did. We had foreign service officers of some professionalism who were Arabists. We had intelligence analysts and others who knew about the place. But the big decision makers didn't. I mean, someone like Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld knew nothing about Iraq and went on being impervious to information about Iraq even after he conquered the country. And so we all know he came out and denied that there was looting in April and May of 2003. He maintained that CNN had a loop of one guy who had stolen one vase, and they kept looping it over and over again. This is what he said in his public comments. He said, how many vases could they have? I think McGuire would tell us that they more or less invented the vase and have been making them for thousands of years, and that therefore they have quite a few. And then in the summer of 2003, Rumsfeld denied that there was a guerrilla war in Iraq. And he even said he had referred to a dictionary in order to settle this issue. And it was obvious to me that there was a civil war, a guerrilla war in Iraq in the summer of 2003, because I had lived in Lebanon in the late 1970s as an academic and journalist, and had seen one with my own eyes, and it looked an awful lot similar in what was going on in Baghdad. And then before the war, in February of 2003, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz gave an interview. It was obvious to the interviewer that we were going to war, and they asked Wolfowitz why. And he said, well, you know, Iraqis will be much better friends for the United States than had been the Saudis. The Saudis are Wahhabis. They're rigid kind of Sunni Muslims, and they have holy cities in their country, so it makes it impossible for us to have U.S. troops there without a lot of trouble, and Al-Qaeda had complained about U.S. bases in the Holy Land. He said, on the other hand, Iraqis are Shia, they're secular. And then they don't have that issue of holy cities. And when I heard this on the radio, I fell off my chair. And I said, Shia are secular, and Iraq doesn't have the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala. What in the world are these people thinking? I thought this is not going to go well at all. So if you attend to things that the decision makers made, it was very clear. And of course, it's also come out that Bush didn't know there were Sunnis and Shiites in Iraq and so forth. That there was a lack of expertise in the high decision-making circles. And I don't deny there was expertise somewhere in the U.S. government, but it clearly wasn't being listened to. And I mean, not only were academics frozen out of this debate in Washington, but State Department people were frozen out of it. I've been told by state people that, you know, the pro-war people would call a conference, a one-day conference, and they would set an agenda that couldn't be departed from, and then they would not like invite certain people, and they had it all set up, you know, as it was rigged. So, I mean, imagine, you know, Midwestern college professors, what would happen to them in this debate if fairly powerful State Department people were being frozen out of it. So there is this problem with Iraq that, I mean, there wasn't all that much expertise in the country about Iraq to begin with, but what there was, for the most part, was disregarded. And it does pitch the issue of the relationship of academics to the government. And I think for a moment after September 11th, there was an opportunity to renegotiate the relationship between university academics and the government because, I mean, who likes Al-Qaeda? Whatever the you know, National Review thinks, academics genuinely are not Al-Qaeda and don't approve of them and are not terrorist sympathizers and so forth. A lot of politics are played with these sorts of things, but I think there was an opportunity for a closer cooperation because I think the big difference between academia is servicing really local communities, students and a wider urban community often, and the academics are about basic research. You know, they're in science, you have a difference between somebody who's doing basic research and somebody who's doing practical policy-oriented research. The people who make the transistor radios are different from the people who invented the transistors. So the academics are mostly doing the deep basic research. And, you know, an academic would be looked down upon if they didn't spend several years researching and writing a book. I mean, to come out with their ideas about what happened yesterday all of a sudden is transgressive of academic norms because it hasn't been vetted by other academics and it hasn't been thought through and it's not solidly based, it could be wrong, and so forth. So the whole orientation of academia is towards considered long-term research, which doesn't sync very well with Washington. I mean, if I were doing a study on Iraq that I thought might come out in 2010, well, you know, that's a whole different administration. And a whole different situation would be irrelevant until it actually came out to policymakers. So there's this problem of lack of sync between the norms of academia and the norms of policymaking in government. And then there is an ideological divide. Universities are ideologically much more diverse than is often alleged. They, after all, do have business schools, which, again, contrary to the allegations, are not full of socialists. But on the whole and by and large, the kind of academic that would be doing policy-related research in a university is probably not in the same ideological camp with some of the high policy makers in Washington. And that causes problems because ideology does matter in analysis, although it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter to the extent that people don't read each other or try to take account of each other's information and analyses. And so I think there is a poor fit. And I mean, my own biography is an instance where some of these divides can be bridged at certain points. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee didn't invite me to speak about Iraq, and I was on an expert panel with Toby Dodge, a prominent British political scientist of Iraq, and Richard Pearl. It was the Cole-Dodge-Pearl panel, and it was in the middle of the Mahdi Army uprising of spring of 2004. during which I tried to explain what I thought was happening in Iraq at the time, for as far as I could tell from the Arabic press. And Pearl actually, you can look at the transcript, maintained, he said, well, I wouldn't call it an uprising. And this sort of puzzled me, because it very clearly was. Barry McCaffrey came on CNN around that time and said, was asked what we had to do about Iraq at that point. And he said, well, we have to restore supply and communications lines to the south and regain control of the capital. Well, if you're the occupying power, and you have lost supply and communications lines to the south and lost control of the capital, that's an uprising. And I asked the staffers later on, I said, why did Pearl say that? I mean, it was very clearly not true. And they said, well, you have to think about Congress people as having time split into 15-minute segments, and people come and talk to them for 15 minutes about agricultural policy, about this, that, and the other thing, serially. And they don't mostly have very much time to read, and so they know what experts come and tell them. So Pearl is hoping that people would actually pay attention to his allegation that there was no uprising in spring of 2004 in Iraq. And so I think beyond the issues of expertise is, I mean, how do you get beyond fantasy making? Because a great deal of the discourse I find in politics in Washington is not only detached from the analysis of our intelligence agencies and of seasoned State Department veterans, but detached actually from any kind of reality facts on the ground, because politics is about pushing policy. And if you're pushing a policy, the last thing you want is contradictory facts emerging. So where can there be an intersection between academia and policy making? Well, I think that the blogging and the internet are beginning to break down some of the barriers that had been erected, because academics, published in obscure places, and their works were in research libraries, and they weren't generally available, even sometimes to policymakers, who wouldn't know how to find them or how to understand them if they did find them. And I think that what the internet has done is really making universities more transparent and less opaque, and less like the old Chinese Mandarin bureaucracy. The reason that Mandarin is so difficult is that they didn't want the hoi polloi understanding what they were doing. And I think a lot of academic writing is difficult, in part because it's controversial and people are avoiding saying things in a clear way. And I think that the internet is breaking that down. There's a demand from the public that academics speak to them, and in a clear way, and a demand for expertise. And I think a lot of academics are feeling increasingly that the world is pretty important, and they shouldn't just let it pass by without having any remarks about it. And I think that in a way, the internet, blogging, and quick internet publication of opinion pieces and so forth may be the conduit by which academic expertise starts to make its way into policymaking. And certainly I can see that in my own regard. I have a lot of readers among policymakers in Iraq and in the Middle East more generally. And so whereas in the old days, I think 10 years ago, I would have been without a voice in these debates, even though I lived a long time in the region, I know the languages, and I attend to what's going on. Now I do have a voice, and it is communications technology that's really making the difference. And I think we're at the beginning of that process rather than the end.
Great. Thank you very much, Juan. Thank you all. I thought what I might do is before I open it up, also share, because I think it's important we have two great Iraq and Middle East experts here with us today, but there's another dimension that I think is important to put on the table, which I'm going to try, because I think it's important to broaden the discussion. As a Japan guy, as someone who focused and thought about Japan for a long time, this is not an area that I want to raise another element of expertise that may not just be area studies, because it reminds me of my time at UCLA when there was a debate between what was called the rational choice crowd and the area studies crowd. And essentially, without losing all of you in a boring discussion of the semantics of rational choice, there has developed, I used to be the secretary for something called the Jacob Marshak Colloquium, for the study of mathematics and the behavioral sciences. And what does all that mean? We were looking at the application of mathematical methods and economic methods and whatnot through a whole cross-section of behavioral science work. And I remember Mansur Olson, the late Mansur Olson, coming to me one time and saying, you know, Steve, I'd really like you to write a paper or something and explain to me why the Japanese aren't maximizing their utilities like everyone else does. And I share this because there is I'm glad you got it, but I mean, there is a process here of discussion where there are different kinds of expertise that perhaps regional area, cultural expertise was sort of targeted as something that was sometimes getting in the way of other kinds of expertise, which was strategic thinking. I came out as a youngster, sort of out of the Rand Corporation at the time, and even then, and this would be the case, that even if you looked outside of traditional area, cultural, or language expertise, the other dimensions of expertise also haven't been recognized. Because if you were a young game theorist, for instance, you might have looked at Iraq and some of what Saddam Hussein was doing with the so-called WMD program as being a natural thing, a shell game, somewhat. Why? To deter Iran or to deter other regional neighbors that might have been there. And it was remarkable that even in the journalistic reporting, now it may have been in the strategic I participated in some of the military and strategic simulations where that was discussed. In fact, what may be going on before any invasion of WMD of looking at this. But at least in the broad public commentary, it was missing. It was as if they were there. It was just simple binary issues. The WMDs weren't there, not there, but not looking at the sort of broader as we call them, games that Saddam Hussein might have been doing with his regional neighbors. And game theory might have led you down a very different path that might have helped you expect something that had nothing to do, in fact, with knowing about knowing Arabic or knowing the particulars. Another area of interest of mine was, while I opposed strongly the invasion of Iraq for various reasons related to what I thought it would do to puncture the mystique of America's superpower status, and I worried a lot about that at the time, I wrote a piece for the New York Times in just after the invasion in 2003 that said, okay, now the time is to study occupations. Which occupations have gone right? Which occupations have gone wrong? Well, when you look at the history of occupations, most occupations go badly. I mean, it's just something that don't go well. But those that do go well have one peculiar feature that's not peculiar, it's logical, is that a class of political and economic winners are created that become very supportive of that presence. And in Japan, I see my good friend Takashi Oka here, and we've had a lot of discussion. Takashi was a very famous journalist out of Japan, took Time magazine in Japan. We've had many discussions. But one of the key functions was breaking up aristocratic estates in Japan and land reform. And creating a class of winners that became essentially stakeholders in the new order. What bothered me at this time was whether or not that had any applicability or not to Iraq. People weren't studying this. They were not pondering it. George Bush, when he was talking about the successful occupation and democratizing of Japan, was not putting land reform at the height of the list of the various issues that were there, and looking at what was there something that could be drawn from that from Iraq. And I suggested maybe a bad idea, but at least I put on the table looking at the Alaska Permanent Fund, at least as a way to create a stakeholder approach that might be different in thinking about Iraq in the future and deriving some revenue so you could create something that would draw the focus of the people together and actually make them winners when in fact their resources essentially had been run by interests other than their own. And this got some play actually for some period of time. Jerry Bremer, Colin Powell, people as diverse as forgetting our former governor of Virginia, or former senator of Virginia who lost. George Allen was supportive of the idea. Barbara Boxer was supportive of the idea. But it eventually didn't go very far. But the point was there were these kinds of discussions that, again, not to conflict with McGuire, Gibson, and Juan Cole on this, but I just wanted to lay out that there are different kinds of expertise other than area expertise that are part of this equation. And just in final, one other area to think about that I think was missed early on. Peter Bergen, who is CNN's terrorism analyst, but also here as a senior fellow at the New America Foundation, spends a lot of time looking at the subject of terrorism, hung out with bin Laden, became famous for it. in his book Holy War, Inc., about bin Laden. He was one of the first Americans to interview Osama bin Laden. But nonetheless, the reason I found Peter at the time was looking at the subject of, did America have some blind spots? Did the strategic calculus with various parts of the world in which we had a strong presence changed in the minds of the citizens in those countries in which we had bases? And I was very interested in Korea and very interested in the Okinawan bases in Japan, because you had enormous protests rising because of the presence of those bases, the largest since 1960. And I said, at least it's a fair question to ask of whether or not what would drive this. And this is all before 9/11. And Peter had been writing about these same kinds of subterranean tensions building in the Middle East. And so again, this was another area, but I remember talking to Strobe Talbot, whom I respect, think greatly of. Strobe was then Deputy Secretary of State. The Okinawan G7, G8 summit was being planned for Okinawa. And I asked, I said, as you think about the future of terrorism, or you think about the future of conflict in various places, do you worry a little bit about Okinawa? And he said, why would we worry about Okinawa? And I said, well, the place is culturally and historically distinct from the rest of Japan. It's the poorest prefecture in Japan. 85% of our military installations are on this small island. It wouldn't take much. You know, you had a rape of a 12-year-old girl by 3 U.S. servicemen, and then really tens of thousands of people coming. I said, what do you think takes to create a well-organized group that would begin kidnapping military dependents and throwing Molotov cocktails and moving up the ladder of concern? Now, I'm not saying that would have happened, but not to think that it could happen demonstrated to me some element of it hubris or sort of a blind spot. And this had nothing to do with the Middle East, but nonetheless, you could ask these big questions, and I have to say that those kinds of questions, and this is during the Clinton administration, were not being asked. So I did want to put some other points to this to basically take us out of just the Bush administration, just the Middle East, and just area studies to look at a broader field for these questions. But let me open the floor now for either questions or further comments. Yes, sir. And if you'll identify yourself, please, and we can hear you, just use your lungs.
Peter Beckford, I'll turn this way.
Oh.
I'm an academic who worked for 30 years in the government, and to explain that, I taught full-time at 3 colleges outside this area and 3 adjunct professorships in the city. But I tried to devote my life professionally to bringing together the academic expertise which I encountered in the University Studies Association, in the American Community Science Association, and so on, with the role of government. And then I joined government at the end of the Ford administration. I noticed that there was tremendous expertise at the mid-level that the academics generally don't know about. And as I worked over those years, and Ryan Crocker was mentioned, he was in my class before he went to Iraq in 76, 77 in my year-long seminar. That expertise gets up to a certain point, but the outside world does not see where it gets stopped. And I think that that is one of the most crucial issues. And then a further variable would be that if I were to give a long talk, I would say in summary that during the Ford, Carter, and Bush Senior administration, there was more openness to expertise than during the Reagan, Clinton, and the current Bush administration. But I'd like to add one more thing, because Iraq is the starting point here. I taught 11,500 students, a few of them in this room, and never was I told what to do except when we fought and finally were authorized to have a seminar for pre-departure on Iraq. And the only thing that authorized it was that Ambassador Nancy Rayfield allegedly was going to come to take the seminar before she left. And I was told not to do the 5 days or the 3-day minimum, which I had proposed, but a day and a half. And I had told them that outside Washington, it so happens, so God is my witness, the top experts were in Chicago and Ann Arbor, Michigan. I was told not to bring in the top experts on Iraq, and I was told not to take the class to the National Islamic Center, to which I had taken all of my classes so people would get a feel. And I asked my supervisor, who informed me, who instructed me, I said, your decision? He said, of course not. Who is it? In this building? He said, no, it's from the highest level at state. And we can it certainly was not Colin Powell. So often there's a deliberate attempt to freeze out expertise, while at the same time, as a number of you know, the State Department, through its Bureau of Intelligence Research, has external research where they bring in academics, the CIA, the DIA, they have mechanisms for bringing in outside experts, and even more super secretive organizations, without ever publicizing it, do bring in a few people. However, they have to be vetted by the ideologues, and those are the political appointees who are brought in from the outside, and they are the screeners. And so if John Bolton says, no Bechtold, okay, or in my case, Dr. Wolfowitz says, he will no longer speak to the Joint Flag Officer Warfighting Seminar, which I addressed 28 times for 2-star generals. Well, then you see, you freeze out the expertise that does exist. And so that is an additional element.
Thank you very much. Let me take some other questions coming. Yes, sir.
My name is Danny Singh. I think our main speakers, Mr. Gibson, Mr. Cole, quite right, focus on academic expertise and how it's not being used. To some extent, Mr. Cole went further and said with the internet coming in, there were avenues available for academics to contribute to the dialogue that's going on. I wonder whether we shouldn't also look at other elements of expertise, used and misused, and not used at all in the case of Iraq. I'm thinking of practical expertise. Look at areas in which an attempt was made to substantially change certain things in Iraq without any expertise whatsoever. Look, for example, at privatization of public enterprises. Tom Foley saying, I believe in privatization with no real expertise. Now, this is not necessarily an area in which academics have a great deal to offer other than studying. But there are people with hands-on experience, and that hands-on experience is a very important part of the kind of expertise that can and should be used. Moving away from privatization, look at the attempts to bring in a new stock exchange in Iraq. You don't need to go to academic expertise for that. You need to go to stock exchanges somewhere. And the people who were used in that kind of case were not used. And there's a whole slew of hands-on expertise in the areas of economic planning, etc.
Thank you.
That could have been good.
Thank you. Yes,
What wasn't understood at the time was, in 1986, during the Iran-Iraq War, the government of Iraq became aware that it could not carry on a war and also run all these industries. And so they began to privatize already in 1986. And Saddam at one point stood up and said that the socialist economy was over in a meeting. And after this, they did set up a stock exchange. It was a funny little stock exchange, and it only had certain kinds of industries that had been let loose, such as hotels. The big hotels were privatized. And there were certain other industries that were privatized. But in the long run, they were only going to keep as government entities the military industries. And they intended to spin off all the rest of them. There was already a movement toward privatization in Iraq going back to 1986. And there was already a stock exchange in existence. And all they had to do was adapt to this. And to pay attention to the real expertise they refused to pay attention to was the Iraqi expertise inside the country. There were plenty of people, even though there had been this tremendous brain drain all through the 90s from the sanctions. And the sanctions were kept on, in my opinion, basically to drain Iraq of as much expertise as possible, because 40,000 a year were being let into Australia, and 40,000 a year were being let into New Zealand, and then Canada took some, and America took some, and even Malaysia got in on it. They were trying to drain as much expertise as possible out of the country. Even though that happened, there were still many, many technicians. There were lots of engineers, there were a lot of architects, there were lots of even soil experts and who were still in the country and could in fact have been doing this. The first thing that we did when we went into Iraq is we refused to deal with state companies. And they were paying Iraqi engineers to sit in their desks and do nothing for months, such as electrical engineers. And in fact, back in 1991, after the first Gulf War, where we had destroyed the entire infrastructure, one of the things that keeps being said, and Bremer has said it in numerous talks, is it's so hard to redo Iraq because of the 35 years of neglect of the infrastructure by Saddam Hussein. As a matter of fact, the Ba'ath in the 70s built up an incredible infrastructure, overnight almost. New roads, new factories like crazy, built up almost in about a 5-year period. A tremendous infrastructure, which we then bombed to smithereens in 1991. We destroyed the infrastructure. And then through the sanctions period, we refused to let them have the spare parts. We refused to let them fix things. There was purified water down to the village level with Culligan purification plants. We refused to let them work those, first of all, because they were using chlorine or bromide. So they couldn't be, that was on the list of prohibited things that went into the country. But also because probably it was French Culligan, it wasn't American Culligan. There was, the expertise was still there. And after the Gulf War, after we knocked out all the electricity in the telephones, they had the telephones working within 1 month. They had the electricity working in some capacity within 2 months. They had the refineries working within 2 months. And there was plenty of expertise, and they built 100 bridges in 1 year. There was plenty of expertise left in the country. And even in 2003, there was plenty of expertise. But instead, we brought in these people who hadn't been in the country for 30 years, and we were going to have them run the country. There was tremendous resentment of that. And we refused to let the people in the country do anything. And they imported labor to actually put up the new electric lines. And of course, the Iraqis just went up and cut them down and sold them off as copper. And had they put the Iraqis to work, had they trusted the Iraqis, it would have been a very, very, very different story.
What you're saying is very right. Just a minor follow-up to that is that the first thing that Bremer did, all right, was to introduce the policy. His first action was to get rid of all the Ba'athists in every ministry, in every government position. And that's where the expertise that you're talking about existed. You push them out, you left a vacuum.
Could I just say that with regard to Peter Bechtel's fine intervention, that, back in Andrew Jackson's day and so forth, there was a spoils system in Washington, even for lower level government positions, clerks, and the people would just bring in their cronies and give them government jobs, and then you'd have this overturn every 4 years and so forth. And to some extent, that was that spoils system was limited by the professional bureaucracy and the government service ranks. So if you're GS 12, 13, 14, you're not in danger of losing your job because the administration changed. Well, I think what has happened in Washington is that the bureaucracy has been repoliticized because the upper echelons, the SES political appointees, are interfering with how the professional bureaucrats run things. So I think Congress should look into this, because I don't think that some political appointee as Deputy Secretary of State should be telling Peter Bechtel where he can take his class. I mean, I think that should be illegal, and I think that the whole government suffers if kind of a stealth reintroduction of the spoils system has occurred, and then people use their political appointments to manipulate the bureaucracy, to exclude certain voices, to exclude certain expertise. It's not right, and this would require congressional intervention.
In the very back, yes.
Tom Bridle from the National Democratic Institute. I was in Iraq and Baghdad for about a year in 2005, 2006, working with the Parliament. And I wanted to really second the point that you made, Steve, about the importance of kind of cross-sectoral knowledge, because what was striking to me there is how similar the situation in Iraq was to the situation in any country where you have the loss of the state, the loss of the government, and suddenly these efforts to try to rebuild these government institutions like a parliament, like all the ministries, like all the other things, and there's a fairly substantial body of knowledge and information about what happens in that kind of a culture and the issues that you face. What do you do with the people in the army? What do you do with the people who are in the party and got sucked into the ministries? What do you do with private? So I think that's a very good point. But my question actually was about what's happening with academics now in Iraq and Afghanistan, because there has been, really in the last year or so, from what I understand, and I already saw it when I was there, this effort to bring in some expertise from anthropologists, particularly from sociologists, to try to, beef up the PRTs so that there's an academic supposedly in each of the regional PRTs. If you've observed that process at all and what you think about it. And then I also had an antiquities question, which is how much damage has really been done to these antiquities by particularly the sites, by the military? I've seen like gyms, for example, with tombs in the middle of them that are being used as
Thank you. So I'm going to ask for quick responses. 'Cause
Okay,
we've got
how
a
much
lot of
damage by the
questions
military? We don't.
to the antiquities.
We don't
case.
know very much because we haven't been there. We know we can spot on satellite images that there is damage being done at the expansion of these bases that they're doing. We know, for instance, there are military posts on the top of very, very important archaeological sites, and so there's bound to be some damage. But there has been damage done at Babylon. There's damage done at Ur. We don't know what's going on with that. But the damage is basically coming from the looting, which has been going on unstopped, completely unstopped, since the day the war started. And that is massive damage. We're losing whole sites. We're losing whole cities. So, there has been very bad damage. Oh, and by the way, that sale of an antiquity the other day in Sotheby's for $57 million means that no archaeological site and no museum in the world at this point is safe.
Yeah, and as a follow-on, that looting of the sites actually contributes to the poor security situation, because who's looting the sites is militias, and then they're financing themselves partially through antiquity smuggling. So it's very unwise to allow it to go on, just quite apart from the loss of knowledge and art and so forth. With regard to I'm having
Drawing
the
academic
PRTs and so forth. Well, look, in my view, if the art, there are two parts of an academic interaction with government. One is in helping and formulate policy on the basis of expertise. That the academics, with regard to Iraq policy, were completely frozen out of, and indeed a participation in that was not even ever on the table. But the academics aren't asking to be allowed to help with the war effort. To the degree that the Pentagon is now turning to anthropologists and so forth after having made a mess of everything, and now asking, well, how do we deal with the tribes now that we're there? This is not what the academics had asked to sign up for. And indeed, the American Anthropological Association has just issued a very strong condemnation, because academics, generally speaking, don't want to do things that help to get people killed. And that's really a fear that they'll be drawn into the war effort. So my own view is if the military needs anthropological expertise and wants to deploy it, then they should create some units inside the military.
Really?
Yeah. Well, because you can't ask civilian anthropologists to go and help you kill people.
I'm going to broaden it. I can't get the back and forth here. We just have too many questions. So I'm going to cluster some, ask your one comment briefly, and I'm going to discipline our speakers here. Gary?
An observation.
Just brief, though, Gary, because I've got to set.
Observation followed by a question.
Yeah.
And that is, we started talking about the role of academics in relation to the policy community. Steve broadens it by saying we've got to look at these sort of functional and cross-cutting pieces. And I just want to add a third piece, which is the concept of diversity, drawing on diversity of perspectives from the academic community. Because it's my recollection, this is the question, that Bernard Lewis spent a lot of time at the vice presidential mansion and was the sort of reigning academic on Iraq. So,
Yeah. Great. Stuart?
Yeah, Stuart Schwartzstein, formerly DOD. One quick observation. I received an email message from an Iraqi scientist now in Amman. I think when last I heard he was still in Amman. In '91, after the First Gulf War, he'd been tasked by Saddam to oversee the restoration of the electrical grid. He volunteered his services to the CPA in 2003. He didn't hear a word back.
Right. Typical.
Okay. Yes.
Mark Paterno, Director of the Foundation. I think that one of the major problems that I'm hearing in this discussion, it's implicit but it hasn't been said, is that the problem with calling upon expertise is that experts notoriously disagree with each other. the more minute you get into the subjects, the more they disagree. So how do you use expertise when you call upon it in the government? We hear the idea that it's used in ways to bolster or justify a preconceived policy decision, and that's used that way simply by selecting the experts and deselecting others. And you could imagine perhaps some sorts of discussions and that were open to a lot of different voices and diverse opinions, and maybe you could imagine those coming to some degree of consensus, but I don't really think that that really addresses the problem, because the history of science is one in which we recognize that the consensus of expert opinion has often been mistaken. So I think that the real question that has to be addressed here is not so much whether to use expertise, but how to use it in a way that's going to be effective and is going to lead to some sort of better consequences than the ones that we've seen.
Thank you for adding that to the discussion. Lorelei?
Thank you, gentlemen, for that. I came to D.C. in '97 from Stanford with a member of Congress who specifically had me doing damage control inside Congress after the contract with America had essentially lobotomized the institution. What Gingrich did that is not very familiar to a lot of people outside Congress was wipe out the internal public sector infrastructure, all the study groups, all the technical professionals, a third of the staff, a lot of the internal convening and recognizing mechanisms, and outsource the policy needs to his conservative think tank universe. And that continues today to some extent, but it was a very effective way to consolidate power and eliminate investigative capacity, all kinds of brain power inside Congress. One of the things that I really miss when I work on the Hill was some kind of a surge capacity at the state and district level, like yourself, Mr. Cole, Mr. Gibson. I mean, what you've done is fabulous with the internet. But do you think there's any possibility to replace that infrastructure, or at least supplement the knowledge level inside Congress with academics and others who are interested in the public sphere but can do it in a much more effective way, which is inside districts and states? Do you see that happening?
Okay, we'll go there, and then let me go right here. Yes, sir. And then we'll take these two. Diane, I'll get to you next, but there's just so much.
I'm a professor at Virginia Tech. I'm actually a political geographer. And there's just one point I wanted to raise, and that has to do with the discipline of geography is essentially one which is been taken over by a certain technological fundamentalism, and I think that's very characteristic of the culture more generally, where geography becomes having it in a GIS as opposed to like a thick regional knowledge, which gets pushed into the margins. And I think those kind of the parochial universalisms that are generated, whether it be from public choice or from techno-scientific forms of knowledge in the academy, I think are also part of what we need to be discussing.
Fascinating. And yes, sir.
I have a comment. My name is Hamid Al-Kifai. I'm an Iraqi writer and journalist. Regarding the point that Mr. Cole made about the Shia and Sunni religious secular, I think everyone. Well, I don't know if people in this country know that the education system in Iraq is secular, right from the Ottoman Empire to 2003.
Mm-hmm.
And there are attempts now to make it religious. But we have an educational system that is secular. The people of Iraq are secular in general, not necessarily Sunni or Shia. They are all because of the educational system, because of the type of government we had. But during the 90s, during the sanction period, Saddam Hussein came up with the idea of the faith campaign. And because people were poor, deprived, and so they turned to religion. I think the current religious tide will not last. It's a frenzy that will probably die down. What happened was that the religious parties have the money, they have got the people, the necessary zeal to stand up, while the secular, usually they are middle class or academics or people, intellectuals who do not, they don't tend to be violent or turn into militias. So Iraq now, because of the current situation, has the people who have the upper hand are the militias, people with the money, while the secular, the intellectuals, the academics, either they have left the country or they are there but they kept quiet or joined, they have even joined the religious parties.
Thank you very much. So let me pause there for a moment. We'll see how much further. There's a lot of great stuff here, but very quickly we've had, and I'm going to be unjust to everyone's good comments and questions. Bernard Lewis, the electronic grid guy who wasn't called back, the battles among expertise, the academic in the room and the academic outside, Lorelei Kelly's comment about congressional expertise, fascinating comment on political geographers and technological fundamentalism in that arena. That's probably not doing justice, but fascinating comment question. And then also about the education system and how you see it. So, any comments?
I can do one on geography, but it also relates to something you said on
Yes.
on the land reform.
Right.
If they had gone in and started trying land reform in Iraq just after this war, it would have been an absolute disaster, because land reform already started after the '58 revolution, in which they broke up all the big holdings and they broke them down and gave individual farmers 20 donums, and then they found that because there's an ecological problem in southern Iraq, if you break down into small holdings, it will not work, and you have to have a bigger holding. So what they did is to do communes, and have these people with their individual holdings going into communes to work, because you need a bigger. It has to do with salt. And
Just to be clear, I never advocated land reform for Iraq. I advocated a piece of the action in the oil business.
But there is now an attempt in Iraq to do land reform, because what has happened is all these expatriates have gone swooping back in,
Right.
and they're going in and claiming their grandfather's property, which was taken away in '58. And the farm property, and they're trying to reclaim all this, and it's going to just lead to absolute. It will not be accepted by the population. It's just going to cause more problems.
Thank you, Juan.
Well, let me say something about the general philosophical principle with regard to drawing on academic expertise. I'm afraid that I think that, the Greeks used to think up these paradoxes where the arrow was shot, but it could never actually reach its target because time was divided and so forth. And the question is really set up in that paradoxical form, which a paradox is always a sign that the premises are wrong. And I actually don't think that if you took the political scientists who meet at the Middle East Studies Association and brought them together, there would be several hundred of them, and polled them on how likely Iraq was as a fertile ground for democratization, that there would be any substantial number of them who would say the prerequisites for successful democratization were there in spring of 2003. Yes, when you get down to more minute issues of policy, you might get some substantial disagreements, but then it's good for the policymakers to hear the disagreements and the reasons for them. I mean, I perceive this tendency in Washington journalism and policymaking to play gotcha. And people tend to take a very glib and superficial point and then push it as though that's what's important. But when somebody makes an argument, one of the things that you have to do them the favor of attending to is the reasons for which they're making the argument, the information on which they're making the argument. And if you're weighing two arguments and somebody's got a lot of reasons and a lot of information and somebody's got less, then you have to pay attention to that. Bernard Lewis came on Lou Dobbs' show, and that was a mighty duo, and said that that the fears of Iraq breaking up were unfounded because Iraq is an oil state, and oil states stay together because of the central resource sort of acting as a centripetal force. But is that really true if, there are several fields and they're not all in the same area, and there are people who might grab one field or another and split off and take it with them? So, the premise that Lewis was putting forth, that the mere fact of an oil state guarantees that it stays together, could be challenged in all kinds of ways. Historically, like Nigeria was an oil state, but it had a civil war, and so forth. So when someone like Lewis says something, the fact that they're Bernard Lewis is not irrelevant. This is somebody who has spent 50 years, or must be more like 70 years, studying the Middle East. But then the question is, when they make an argument outside their field, because he's a medievalist, does the argument stand up? And what I miss in a lot of these policy debates, as I see them reflected in the press and in politician statements and so forth, is that willingness to grapple with the premises of arguments. And I think if you do that, then expertise can be deployed, and I think it would be all to the good.
And one thing I want to add to Juan's comment, and we'll just take a quick roundup here of final comments before we have to close. What would really interest me about the Iraq case is there is a lot of gotcha going on constantly. And I don't know whether that can be changed. But what I do find interesting, and there are some people, we had Noah Feldman, who was on staff at New American Foundation, who eventually worked in the CPA and some others. But what's interesting is when you talk about the composite of the CPA and what happened in the early days, and you compare that to, say, Japan and what went on, there's some interesting things that weren't done this time. One is mistakes are part of the game. I mean, you make mistakes. Sometimes the United States purged and disallowed the product, Japan's parliament. So the first post-war Japanese leader who would have come, eventually became the founder of the LDP, was Hatoyama. We purged him. It was probably a mistake. It probably bred a lot of other things later. But nonetheless, when you look at the fundamental dynamics of what the United States did in Japan, a lot of it was directed and it unleashed the socialists and communists in Japan, which eventually we had, for very strategic reasons, to readjust. And we did readjust, but we kept up a kind of backup room, in my view, and we kept the ability to modify position. What I find interesting, and maybe it's my own crude understanding, we didn't give ourselves that latitude in Iraq. We didn't say to ourselves, mistakes might happen, you might have to shift in a different direction, use some of the tools and methodologies as an occupier to go in a different direction. So I just wanted to add that. That's another interesting piece of the story. But let me gather some quick things, and we're going to, yes, sir.
Eric Davis, Ferguson University. I think it's implicit in Juan Cole and Matt Gibson's comments, but one form of expertise which I think is critical, it's not been mentioned, is Iraqi expertise.
Right.
I've talked to a lot of Iraqis who have been, for example, met with Jay Garner, who were only there for 2 weeks. And he was listening to them, and I think we would have seen a very, very different type of outcome. And we have seen it where projects have developed from the bottom up based on Iraqi initiatives rather than from the top down. So this whole idea of whether we could have developed a democracy or could not have developed a democracy is obviously a counterfactual type of argument. But nevertheless, I think that we do have to consider in future situations like this to think more of a bottom up rather than a top down.
Okay.
And the second thing I'd just like to make is about I mentioned you can use Skype, which you can download for free and buy a $10 headset at Best Buy. You know Arabic, you can talk to Iraqis day in and day out. You don't have to go there. You can learn a tremendous amount.
Thank you. Diane, quickly.
Hey, I'm Diane Perlman. I'm clinical political psychologist and competent. Anyway, I'd also like to suggest along some other lines, applying to academia like a professional practice. Because in cycles of violence, like you said, about studying occupation, also there's studies on sanctions, how you reduce terrorism, how you reduce cycles of violence. And a lot of us predicted before the war, I had an emergency statement warning, duty to warn, professional duty to warn. And I think we think of this in terms of political malpractice, and that there's a lot of understanding of how.
Great. Thank you. Jeff, in the back.
Federation of American Scientists. So there was a comment earlier about academic policy advice being ignored. This particular administration, and others can comment on other administrations, any scientific advice on climate change, energy, Surgeon General's office. So I think it's endemic across the board with political appointees suppressing scientific information for ideological reasons. And then there was a gentleman who made a report that Mr. Cole, I thought you were a little bit derisive of, which is if you have 500 academics who are correct on a particular subject, we mentioned the political science organization, you can take 2 of them, put them on a government panel, give them the soapbox, and those 2 overcome the other 498 and completely suppresses that information. And that's the game that's played in Washington in each administration by setting up you're setting it up, you know the outcome, you know what you want to do, and you've got 18 months in every administration to do exactly what you decide to do in the transition. And the bureaucracy is to be rolled over because they're Fidel Castro, they're there forever, and you've got a certain period of time and you're going to push through your agenda. And, bodies be damned, they go flying.
Where I find that a little disappointing to some. I mean, I agree with you.
Right,
Where I
yeah,
find a little
I'm
disappointing
disappointed
is
in it,
that and Juan Cole has been an interesting example. Differently, is that as part of this discussion, it can't just be blame the government. In my view, it's got to be, why haven't that public intellectual or that policy intellectual or that thought intellectual found alternative means? Now, SSRC and others have found New America Foundation. Maybe this will get on the web in a little bit, but there is a responsibility to promulgate. And I will tell you, as one of the few, and there are some others in this room, few critics of the Iraq invasion at the time, this town, and I would say academia at large, not broadly, I mean, the further you got out from Washington, the more dissidents you would find. But this town was quiet. There were very few. I did all sorts of TV at the time because there was nobody criticizing because of the costs and consequences that they felt that they would endure for doing that. So it's not, and so I would tell you that there's a political correctness game going on, but also if you're not being heard, there are alternative venues. This is a free trade zone for influencing decision makers, in my view, and there are lots of other ways to find avenues. I would just put on the table.
I don't disagree
Yeah.
with you at all. I was just referring to the conversation that was on.
Right. Warren Coates and then this gentleman, and then we'll have to bring to a close with final comments from Juan and Gavin.
Okay, Warren Coates, I'm the Senior Monetary Policy Advisor to the Central Bank of Iraq and the Central Bank of Afghanistan. I want to reemphasize...
Warren Coates creates currencies in all of the rough parts of the world.
I want to reemphasize the importance of Iraqi expertise and of technical expertise that some others have commented on. One important area in which existing expertise was blocked out was from the international organizations. The International Monetary Fund, with whom I work, the World Bank and others, had developed over many years a lot of expertise in doing many of the technical tasks, such as helping to establish central banks and develop their monetary policy capacities and so on. These, in the early days, it's not true anymore, but in the early days, they were simply locked out of the process. I suppose...
I know that was true at the World Bank as well.
Yeah. I suppose because of the very unilateral mindset of the U.S. in doing this and the distaste of international organizations by the DFA.
Thank you. Yes, sir. And I think you were at the World Bank, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Castle. I was actually nominated to go into his job, and by the very senior guys in New York, and my name went to the Heritage Foundation, and I was and a young lady of 24 years old, surname M. Neo Khan, went, and she came to refound the Baghdad Stock Exchange. But I think the way the government has treated you, Dr. Gibson, pretty much the way this government has treated you, just about says it. I mean, there are academics and there are academics, and you guys are out of the field. You have academics like Mr. Lewis, is that his name?
Yes.
An Englishman.
Yes.
And
Bernard
the University of Chicago.
Princeton.
Well, what? So clever. They all went to Harvard.
Yeah.
These guys are now in charge. These are the anti-communists, rabid anti-communists, and now rabid pro-Israelis. Until the knives come out and the American army is defeated in Iraq, Wall Street defeated, until the knives come out maybe in 10 years' time, we might have a place.
Thank you. Let me offer final comments to McGuire and to Juan.
Well, I liked the idea very much of maybe expanding the forums in which academics can interact with staffers and congressmen. I've done some of that. You know, there are think tanks that'll take you for a week someplace with them, and you brief them and so forth. And I think there's too little of that, and the Congress itself should be making a place. And I think also that the privileging of the think tanks is a mistake, both on the part of journalists and on the part of government. Think tanks have big money behind them, and the staff is chosen on explicitly ideological grounds. And it's one of the great ironies that they then turn around and accuse the universities of being ideological, even though, like, a right-wing think tank has no liberals on its staff. whereas you can't find any university that doesn't have a wide range of political views in it. And I think it's easy for journalists to depend on think tanks because it's hard to find an academic. All students know that they're never actually in their office hours, and tracking them down is maybe more difficult, and then you don't know what they're going to say because they'll have a complex analysis. It's much easier to get a one-liner.
Complex analysis.
Yeah, it's much easier. But if you have on the one hand, on the other hand, kind of story you want to push, well, you call up this think tank and that think tank, and you get your 2 quotes right there, and it's all over with, and you can go home for the day. But there's laziness. It's intellectually wrong. It's going to cause a lot of trouble. And then with regard to government also, a lot of times think tanks have put forward sort of white papers that then become government policy. But they have been pushed by narrow interests, and they're full of flawed arguments and flawed information. And I think if Congress were wise, they would start demanding that certain policy things go down to universities. I mean, the U.S. government spends a lot of money soliciting research from universities in engineering and science and so forth. I think they should be eliciting research from historians and anthropologists and political scientists on a much wider scale than they do now.
Thank you. McGuire?
The freezing out happened, as everybody here knows, also in the State Department. Remember that the State Department had its Arabists wiped out pretty much in the Reagan administration. And it's a miracle that someone like Crocker, who actually was trained as an Arabist and actually knows Arabic and has been in Iraq before, he's actually sitting in Iraq right now. It's a miracle that he survived. So it was across the board. So I don't know whether future administrations will be less ideological or will be less narrow-minded than this particular one, because I've seen it beginning with Reagan and coming through. And academics are under various sorts of pressures. Also, I don't know how Professor Cole exists, because I don't think he can sleep. I don't see how he can do his academic work and also do a blog. It's a lot of work. And I admire him enormously for carrying it on, but I haven't asked his students about it.
It's all due to Mrs. Cole.
Mrs. Cole, okay. Anyway, it's an amazing piece of work. So that, obviously we have to, my point is, although I was under a lot of my academic friends were saying, what are you doing this for? Why are you bothering to speak out at all? And some of the Iraqis were saying, well, why are you speaking up? No, they're not Iraqis, but people are saying, why are you speaking up for antiquities? I mean, for this? I mean, who are you to talk about this? And I said, if we who are in the field don't stand up for our field, who the hell else is going to do it? And the same thing holds, not just archaeology, but anything. Any of us who knows something about the country and who understand how the country works should basically be standing there, not just to inform the U.S. or the world about it, but to stand up for the Iraqis and try to be an intermediary between the forces that are affecting them and them. So.
Just in closing, I think one of the I want to commend the Social Science Research Council for helping to initiate this discussion, and we're very pleased the American Academic Research Institute in Iraq joined us today. But I think that there are many issues raised today which would all be very rich for further discussion, but 2 I think were very important. One is essentially the subject of, in classic academia, in which not necessarily slow, but methodical, empirical, dispassionate analysis takes place in an environment unto itself, has its own norms, mores, rules, doesn't necessarily fit with the fast to action policy environment here, and whether or not there needs to be more institution building between those different dimensions, recognizing in fact that they're different. I also think that the other issue, which is much more important, which has been alluded to in many of the Bernard Lewis comment or many other comments, is that bringing along people who will confirm or affirm one's views if you're in government, as opposed to thinking about what the dimensions are of an open system that has things. Because there is a fundamental question of, okay, I know that this Japan expert over here was brought in to counsel on the Fukuda exhibit. This one with a different view was not. You can't play winners and losers like that all the time. The question was it a relatively open system over time where there were contrary thoughts and views and expertise that were brought into the table, and that the government, for whatever reason, chose to move forward. I think that's what I hope this is eventually about, because you're always going to have people outside. You're always going to have views neglected. The question is, does it become a constructive engagement in process over time? And I think that this question of politicization of views and politicization of expertise and politicization of access is a vital one that we need to struggle with. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. I'm going to adjourn the meeting, but please give our two panelists here today a round of applause.